Why does modern fantasy feel so different from what we used to see, and has modern fantasy lost its soul? Well, let's talk about it. Now, about a year ago, I rewatched The Return of the King, and by the end of the movie, I was overwhelmed with a sense of wonder, sadness, hope, and even nostalgia. You know the scene where Sam, Merry, and Pippin have returned to the Shire, they feel settled and content, but Frodo just doesn't? He doesn't feel at home anymore, and it leads to this heartbreaking decision to leave with the elves. I mean, it's a bittersweet moment that perfectly captures almost everything that is so beautiful about Lord of the Rings. Now, I've always kind of struggled to pin down why that scene makes me want to cry and cheer at the same time. I mean, there's just something so unique about how Tolkien wrote this story and the way it concludes. It masterfully ties up loose ends while still leaving us with a deep emotional response. And then when the end credits roll, okay, fun fact, the end credits last 27 minutes in the extended edition. I mean, apparently for around $100 or something, you can get your name in the credits if you supported the movie or something. I mean, honestly, I wish I'd known about this when I was 5 years old, so I could have had my name immortalized in the greatest movie of all time. Actually, I'm just kind of disappointed my parents didn't make sure of it. Anyway, I digress. What I really wanted to say is that while watching those end credits, one thought kept coming to my mind again and again. Why isn't fantasy like this anymore? When I was younger, I was completely mesmerized by stories like Lord of the Rings trilogy, the original Star Wars movies, and yes, even the Harry Potter books and movies. They all made me feel something really profound, something I've always struggled to put into words. I mean, what is that feeling? And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had that sensory and emotional overload from reading or watching The Lord of the Rings, but hasn't been able to fully explain why it resonates so deeply. So today I wanted to explore that feeling and ask the question, has modern fantasy lost its soul? And what exactly is modern fantasy getting wrong? Or does it actually get anything wrong? Now, while I probably could make a 6-hour video on this topic, I'll try to keep it focused and dive into just a few key points to spark a conversation. Now, I'm prepared to say that I'll probably not get everything right here, but that's a risk I'm willing to take. So with that said, let's jump into part 1 of this video. Now, before we dive into whether modern fantasy has lost its soul, I want to make something clear. I don't think modern fantasy books are soulless. They just feel different from classic fantasy. I mean, over the past few years, I've literally read and loved hundreds of modern fantasy novels. I mean, my love for modern fantasy is real, but even with that love, I can't help to notice a difference between the books I read that were released before the 2000s and those that came after. Now, I'm not using a strict academic definition of classic and modern fantasy here, but when I say modern fantasy, I'm just referring to books that were released in the past 20 years or so, and classic fantasy is simply anything older than that. I know, it's not the most precise definition, but it works for the purpose of this discussion. So, why did classic fantasy feel different? Now, the first factor I want to talk about is the power of the unexplained. When we think about classic works of fantasy, whether it's Lord of the Rings, Mythaga Wood by Robert Holstock, Robin Hobb's Farsi trilogy, or Memory, Sorrow and Thorn by Ted Williams, and so many others obviously, these books intentionally are set in a setting filled with either lost history, civilizations, and myths. Now, I don't know if you have noticed, but often our favorite characters from stories end up being the characters that we don't know much about. So a good example would be Tom Bombadil from Lord of the Rings. I mean, personally, I kinda hate Tom Bombadil. I mean, it feels ridiculous and out of place to have a character bouncing around Middle-earth saying ring-a-ding-a-dillo or whatever he says, but that's not the point of this video. A lot of people not only think Tom Bombadil is a great character, but they absolutely love him. And I think there's a good explanation why. We never really get a full explanation who Tom Bombadil is or where his power comes from. And yet, we don't need it. The mystery adds to the richness of Middle-earth. It makes the world feel bigger, like it's filled with ancient secrets that no one fully understands. That is the magic of the unexplained. Now, other characters could be the Fool from the Realm of the Elderlings, a character Robin Hobb intentionally doesn't want us to know too much about, but those very elements add so much to the story. And I also think that this mystery element also applies to world building. I think that one of the reasons why Lord of the Rings has sustained its cultural power is because there are still mysteries to explore. I mean, who are the two blue wizards? What happens down where the Balrog lives? What exactly is the power of the Ringwraiths? Why didn't they just use the eagles to fly to Mordor? Okay, the last one was a joke, okay? spot, a lot of the books that have filled me with wonder and awe and that spark are the books that have struck that perfect balance of revealing answers, but also withholding enough information to make you intrigued and want to keep exploring. This is also one of the reasons why I have never understood the obsessions with prequels. Obviously, prequels can be done well, but one of the reasons why we loved Han Solo or Boba Fett or the world of Tolkien was due to its unexplained elements. Like Rings of Power, for example, almost seemed to have an obsession of explaining everything and giving the viewer answers to questions that we might simply not want the answer to. Maybe it is for the better that we don't know where Gandalf's staff originated from or how the Shire was founded. I know this is a personal thing, but I generally have almost always loved the first book in a series the most. I mean, I love getting introduced to the world, the mysteries, and I often find that when an author eventually reveals the answers to my burning questions, the answers actually weren't that good. And in some weird way, it can occasionally make me appreciate the story even less. The unexplained elements in these classic stories contribute directly to their emotional impact. I mean, think about The Lord of the Rings again. How many of our favorite moments are tied to mysteries? I mean, the ancient ruins of Weathertop, the dead city of Osgiliath, or the dark regions of Mirkwood. These places aren't fully explained, and because of that, they linger in our minds long after we close the book, contributing to a sense of wonder and awe. I also think that this is the reason why I've always loved fantasy worlds that have like mystical haunted forests or lost civilizations, or even if you look at real life, right? I mean, people are obsessed with the pyramids and the Stonehenge for the simple reason that we do not know everything about its origins. That tension of withholding information is what often makes a fantasy story so enjoyable. Now, while I do think it's really beneficial to withhold information in fantasy, I do think there can be value in occasionally explaining things into detail. For example, I often wonder, how do you start a fire? How does a generator work? Or how do you make a pina colada? Something I've never found the answer to in fantasy. But fortunately, I have been able to find this amazing book called The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, made by today's sponsor, Hungry Minds. Now, the book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization, is the book of incredible inventions and discoveries. I mean, this is a captivating illustrated encyclopedia offering a fascinating journey throughout the most significant human inventions, appealing to both adults and children. And it's not just a book. I mean, it's a fun and engaging way to explore history, making it perfect for collectors, friends, parents, colleagues, or anyone with a curious mind eager to delve into the wonders of human innovation. I mean, genuinely, this is a perfect gift. Now, this book has over 400 pages with the most amazing inventions of humankind, with 180 topics divided into 23 chapters, filled with unique handmade illustrations, printed on high-quality matte art paper, and it's wrapped around with a stunning laminated cover. Now, this project collected more than $3.2 million in investments on Kickstarter and Indiegogo and became one of the top projects on the site, and has literally had more than 50 professionals involved. I mean, this book is absolutely beautiful, and you can buy it and get a discount using my code Viking10. Now, I'll leave a link in the description down below if you want to check it out. Thank you so much to Hungry Minds for sponsoring this video. Move on to part 2 of this video. There's something else I want to touch on here, and that's how themes were handled in a lot of classic fantasy. I mean, especially The Lord of the Rings. One theme in particular stands out, which is the Ubi Sunt motive, which is Latin for where are they? About 4 or 5 months ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Philip Chase, and we discussed why The Lord of the Rings remains so good even after 75 years after its release. And it was during this conversation that Dr. Chase, he introduced me to the Ubi Sunt theme, and it gave me a much deeper appreciation for Lord of the Rings and other classic work. So the Ubi Sunt theme is essentially a reflection on the transience of life, the fleeting nature of glory, and the inevitable passage of time. It's a concept that appears in many medieval texts, but it's also deeply embedded in the heart of a lot of classic fantasy works. Now, there is an old English poem called The Wanderer that Tolkien got inspiration from, and I want to read it to you and see if you get that sense of the fleetingness of life. Where is the horse gone? Where the rider? Where the giver of treasure? Where are the seats at the feast? Where are the revels in the hall? How the time has passed away, grown dark under cover of night, as if it had never been. That poem is absolutely haunting and beautiful. And if you have read the Lord of the Rings books, then you know how prevalent this theme of Ubi Sunt, or where are those who were before us, is in the story. Now, we do get a tiny glimpse of this as well in the movies. For example, when we see Frodo observing the elves leaving Middle-earth, and he says, I don't know why, but it makes me sad. Frodo sees the beauty leaving Middle-earth, and it's a great example of the feeling we often can experience as the fleetingness of life. Now, if you think about it, the entire world of Middle-earth feels like it's standing on the ruins of something greater. Whether it's the crumbling kingdoms of Arnor or the fading elves of Lothlorien, there's always that sense of something is lost. You see this theme so clearly when Aragorn recites the Lament of Rohirrim, which is directly inspired by The Wanderer, the poem I just quoted earlier. You see, it's a reflection on the passing of time and the inevitable change. These once great heroes, kings and civilizations have faded into history, leaving behind only memories and ruins. That sense of loss gives the story its emotional weight and imbues the world with a sense of wonder that modern fantasy sometimes struggles to capture. So now we're getting closer to the heart of it. Why did the ending of The Return of the King fill me with such grief, wonder and appreciation? Well, it's because in that scene, Tolkien masterfully conveyed a profound sense of the fleeting nature of life, a theme literally as old as time. Just to emphasize this point, how timeless this idea is, we even see it in Ecclesiastes, a book that was literally written over 2,000 years ago, where the author reflects, "So I said to myself, the fate of the fool will also befall me. What then have I gained by being wise? And I said to myself that this too is futile, for there's no lasting remembrance of the wise, just as with the fool, seeing that both will be forgotten in the days to come. Alas, the wise man will die just like the fool." Now, the Ubisund motive is a vital part of what gives a lot of classic fantasy its soul. It reminds us of the fragility of all things, the beauty in what's lost, and the mystery of what remains. In these unexplained elements, the ruins of forgotten kingdoms, the echoes of ancient heroes, classic fantasy invites us not only to reflect on the world within the story, but on our own as well, our own history and the fleeting nature of everything we hold dear. Now, obviously, some modern books explore this theme as well, but I rarely see it handled with the same depth as older works of fantasy literature. That said, if you have any recommendations for modern fantasy books that explore the Ubisund motive, please let me know. I'm always open to discover new gems. But before we dive fully into modern fantasy, I want to briefly address a common critique of Tolkien and other classic fantasy authors. The critique that they are too descriptive or slow-paced. I mean, it's a criticism often aimed at older fantasy literature work as a whole, but I think there's more to this style of writing than people often give credit to. Authors like Ted Williams, Robin Hobb, Robert Jordan and Robert Holstock also took their time unfolding their stories, and while that may feel slow compared to modern pacing, I think there's a real value in this approach. I mean, many of today's fantasy books, they move at a breakneck speed, sometimes to their detriment. Now, one of the best examples of why a slower pace can be so impactful is Robin Hobb's Life Ship Trader trilogy, which is one of my all-time favorite series. Hobb's exploration of grief, depression, anger, identity and so much more is nothing short of masterful. And a big part why she's able to handle these themes so well is that the sheer amount of space she was given to develop them. Now, that breathing room allows for a depth and nuance that faster paced stories often struggle to achieve. Now, we're currently in a climate where fantasy novels are getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and I do sometimes wonder how authors are going to be able to analyze themes in such a rich and nuanced way if they are not giving enough time and page count to develop them. I often also feel like modern fantasy can be too overt in its thematic analysis. Occasionally, it's almost like if the themes are being delivered with a flashing neon sign, making it very clear what the author wants you to take away. Now, by contrast, I found that older fantasy stories often handle its themes with more subtlety. The analysis was woven into the story in a way that felt more organic, less in your face. But yeah, this point I'll discuss a bit more later in this video. Yes, I know, I'm just a random guy with a microphone and a camera, so who am I to say that older fantasy books were generally better at handling themes? Obviously, there are thousands of books I haven't read, so this might come across as a generalization, but please stick with me as I will expand much more upon this later in this video. Now, let's move on to part 2 of this video, which I will call the problem of over-explanation in modern fantasy. Now, if you go back 30 years, the fantasy landscape was dominated by Lord of the Rings imitators. I mean, that was a trend. Everyone wanted to be the next Tolkien, and how did they try to do that? Basically by copying his style, his world building, and even his themes. It kind of reminds me of like how on YouTube, you'll often see creators trying to copy the biggest names like Mr. Beast, but whenever you watch a copycat, it's just not as good as the original. I mean, why watch Mr. Least when you can watch Mr. Beast, right? Well, by the 90s, readers started getting fatigued by the relentless Tolkien copycats, and the genre began to evolve. Now, for instance, A Game of Thrones came out in 1966, a great year since that's the year I was born. Is that related to the point? Not really, but it's a fun fact. But what's interesting though is how a Game of Thrones became associated with the rise of a new subgenre called grimdark. Now technically it didn't create grimdark, but it certainly popularized it. Grimdark is generally defined by having morally grey characters, maybe explicit violence, and also generally a more cynical view of the world. And this new subgenre was a smash hit with readers. Since then, we've seen many more subgenres pop up, and fortunately, a much wider range of voices being heard in the publishing industry. While fantasy once felt like a sea of Tolkien rip-offs, today we live in an exciting era where the genre has branched out in thousands of different directions, and that is literally such a wonderful thing. Fantasy has become so diverse that for every point I will make in this video, there will be plenty of exceptions. So bear with me as I try to share my thoughts on a topic that clearly isn't black or white. Well, in today's landscape, we reached a point where some people even see being compared to Tolkien as a negative thing, because that just means that you are writing a quote-unquote generic fantasy story. I mean, aren't we all a bit tired of the classic trope where a farm boy becomes a hero, or villains that lack complexity, or tales without any adult content, diversity, or moral ambiguity? Maybe. I mean, I don't often enjoy overly generic Lord of the Rings imitators myself, but that doesn't mean that today's stories can't learn from what made Lord of the Rings so special. Now, if you have been reading modern fantasy books or following book discussions on YouTube, you'll know that in the past decade or so, there's been a big shift towards highly detailed world building, and particularly the rise of hard magic systems. Now, for those unfamiliar, a hard magic system is one where the rules of magic are clearly defined, leaving little room for mystery. Now, a perfect example of this is Allomancy in Mistborn, one of my all-time favorite magic systems. Now, Brandon Sanderson, he has meticulously laid out the rules, complete with limits and what's possible and what isn't. And also more recently, we've seen the rise of lit RPG, a subgenre where the story incorporates game-like elements such as character stats or leveling up. I haven't explored it much myself yet, but this subgenre has grown significantly in popularity over the last 5 years, which is obviously a very exciting thing for fans of the subgenre. But it's clear that many readers have embraced the shift toward fantasy stories with a more defined rules and limitations, and I think I have a theory as to why. When you look at the critiques leveled against classic fantasy, they often boil down to two main points. One, it's too similar to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or two, it relies too heavily on Deus Ex Machina, which can make the story feel unbelievable. Deus Ex Machina is defined as an unexpected power or event saving a seemingly hopeless situation, especially as a contrived plot device in a play or a novel. While the academic term is Deus Ex Machina, I often refer it to as lazy writing. But this point has been a valid critique of the fantasy genre for decades. The fact that an author can just invent a new rule if they accidentally put the character in an impossible situation, for example. And if you think about it, if the stakes are not real, then the tension deflates from the story and it becomes unbelievable and boring. Therefore, the rise of hard magic system almost feels like the absolute antidote to Deus Ex Machina. You as a reader, you get told all the rules, and if the character is then placed in a seemingly impossible situation, then the author is forced to find a believable solution to the problem. There is simply no room to invent a new rule here. Now, when I read the Mistborn trilogy, that was genuinely one of my favorite elements of the story, since the stakes, they felt so unbelievably high. Whenever Vin, our protagonist, got into a tricky situation, I was frantically turning the pages to figure out how she would survive. But let me just share a quick thought on Sanderson's magic system here. Allomancy has become incredibly popular because it gives the reader a clear understanding of what's possible in the world. But what I would say is that there is a danger with hard magic systems. When magic is treated like a science, it has the ability to lose its unpredictability. So in classic fantasy, magic was often mysterious. Generally, there were always forces beyond the character's understanding, something greater than themselves. For example, think about Gandalf in Lord of the Rings again. We know he's a wizard, but Tolkien never gives us an in-depth explanation of his powers. And because of that, Gandalf, he feels more mystical, more powerful. I mean, there's almost like a sense of awe that comes from not knowing how the magic works. But hopefully you don't get the wrong impression here. I'm actually a huge fan of hard magic systems, and I love detailed worlds and almost everything about modern fantasy. Or let me specify here, I love almost everything about modern fantasy books, not the adaptations. I'm looking at you, Rings of Power. So obviously, my point is not that the introduction of a diversity, hard magic systems, or lit RPG is a bad thing by any means. My argument is simply that when a story places a heavy emphasis on explaining every detail to the reader and nearly eradicates the mystery of its world, it becomes challenging to evoke a sense of wonder and awe, something I think a lot of fantasy readers want in their stories. So while this over-explaining in lots of details approach can enhance tension and introduce fresh concepts, which is a good thing, it often falls short of delivering that kind of wonder found in Lord of the Rings, for example. That said, a lot of modern fantasy books, they do strike that balance effectively. For instance, Richard Swan's Emperor of the Wolf trilogy and John Gwynn's Bloodsworn saga are excellent examples of stories that innovate while still providing that sense of wonder and awe. And moreover, books that have lit RPG elements, for example, or hard magic systems, they do still provoke a sense of wonder. It's just a different kind of wonder than Lord of the Rings, for example, if that makes any sense. Obviously, this discussion about the trade-off between over-explaining and hard magic systems is a very nuanced topic that probably deserves a long video in of itself, because I don't really think you can say modern fantasy or classic fantasy is better. But I hope I'm able to get my point across here. But let's get to my second point about the problem of over-explaining, and that is that themes today feel too obvious. Now, Bookborn, one of my favorite booktubers, please go check her out, made a phenomenal video around a year ago called "Do SFF authors think we are stupid now?" What a YouTube title that is.
The ideas being expressed in SFF recently are becoming a lot less subtle. The idea being that when you read a novel that is trying to make a point or make a statement or make you think about something, that the ideas are becoming very obvious, almost just like constantly hitting you over the head. Instead of requiring any sort of critical thinking, these novels are telling you what to think rather than presenting you with some ideas and letting you come up with conclusions on your own.
Now, I totally agree with Bookborn here that a lot of modern fantasy books are overtly obvious in their handling of themes. The weird thing is that I generally agree with the author's message when I'm reading the book, but for me, at least personally, when it becomes too obvious what the author is trying to say here, it can feel a little heavy-handed. So for example, some modern fantasy books really spell out their themes of power, oppression, or redemption in a way that leaves little room for interpretation. It's almost as if the author doesn't trust the reader to figure out on their own what the message is. Now, while this can be effective for making a point, it can also diminish that emotional depth and nuance that comes with more subtle storytelling. I know that Lord of the Rings, which is basically going to be the book I'm going to keep referencing, but it's a gold standard of fantasy. The themes of friendship, sacrifice, and the battle between good and evil are certainly present here, but they aren't explicitly pointed out on every single page. You feel those themes through the characters' actions and the world around them, rather than having them stated outright. Again, we could also come back to Robin Hobb in her Life Trader trilogy, which deals with incredibly complex themes such as trauma, identity, and generational conflict, but they're explored organically through the characters and their relationships. Robin Hobb doesn't need to hammer the reader over the head with what she's trying to say, because the depth is already there, layered into the fabric of the story. In contrast, I sometimes feel with the modern fantasy that themes are so on the nose that they don't leave any room for interpretation or personal reflection. While in a lot of classic fantasy, that subtlety and room for discovery makes the reading experience much more engaging and rewarding, at least in my opinion. Now, just to emphasize again, I'm specifically focusing on theme here. I do think a lot of classic fantasy stories lack that complexity when it comes to characters, for example. For example, Sauron, he's just an example of pure evil, while Samwise Gamgee is just pure good, you know? There isn't much nuance there, but I think thematically, the themes often don't feel as obvious in classic fantasy compared to modern fantasy books. That isn't to say that modern fantasy can't handle themes well. I mean, there's plenty of examples where it does, but it's definitely a trend, or at least in my opinion, where the thematic message is more overt, and that can reduce that sense of wonder or personal connection that older works often offered. Now, one author that is often criticized for being too obvious with his handlings of themes is R.F. Kuang, an author I absolutely adore. Now, I was really fortunate to attend the Tolkien lecture in 2022 in person, which was held by no other than R.F. Kuang herself. She held a talk called Goodness, Beauty, and Truth, The Value of Art in Time of Crisis, which you can find online, and I would actually recommend it giving it a listen because she did touch on this topic. Okay, side note, whenever I start feeling a tiny bit proud of myself and my achievements, I look up Rebecca Kwong's life. Rebecca Kwong is literally 1 month younger than me and has published 5 novels, sold millions of copies, has a master's degree in contemporary Chinese studies from Oxford, and is currently pursuing a PhD in East Asian languages from Yale. Oh, and she's also much better looking than me. How are we the same age? I'm so jealous of her. But never mind. She had this amazing lecture in 2022 where she covered a wide range of topics. But one of them was the subtle critique I have of fantasy being too obvious in its handling of themes. But sometime over the 20th century, we have become convinced that any art that tries too hard to send a message is bad. And then later on she said, artistry and ideology do not have to stand in opposition. I want us to write our whole hearts out and not shy away from claims that we are being too political, didactic, or ideological. Now, in preparation for this video, I actually revisited this lecture, and logically, I do find myself agreeing with the idea that authors shouldn't shy away from expressing their beliefs. I want art to be honest and authentic, and if an artist or author feels the best way to convey their message is through direct themes, then I wholeheartedly support that. However, on a personal level, I often struggle with how themes are presented today because they just feel too obvious. Again, I know I mentioned this already, but it can kind of come across as the author doesn't trust the reader to engage with the material on their own terms. And worse yet, it can almost feel like the message takes precedence over the story itself, making the narrative almost secondary to the theme. So the fact that a lot of modern fantasy today is very on your nose with its thematic analysis, does that mean that it's lost its soul? No, I don't think you can say that. But what I do think you can say is that the fantasy genre has at least evolved into something different and often can lack either that sense of mystery and wonder or just be too heavy-handed with its analysis of themes. Now, I might make another video addressing the ways in which fantasy has lost its soul, particularly concerning adaptations. Oh, there's so much to unpack there. So yeah, if you're interested in an hour-long commentary on the issues surrounding modern fantasy adaptations, let me know. Now, in many ways, I don't want modern fantasy to change too much. Series like Mistborn, The Soulmore Archive, The Greenbow Saga, and The First Law, just to mention a few, are the reasons why I fell in love with the genre. However, I believe there are valuable lessons we can draw from the success stories like Lord of the Rings and The Realm of the Elderlings. Firstly, I'd love to see more fantasy embrace simplicity in their attention to details. I know, it's trendy at the moment to explain every aspect of the world in much detail, something that certainly has its place in the fantasy landscape. It's just the fact that I sometimes long for stories that evoke that wonder through the deliberate choice to leave certain elements unexplained. I mean, omitting specifics about a story or a magic system can often enhance the narrative and enrich the reader's experience. Secondly, I'd appreciate a shift toward handling themes in a less overt or in-your-face manner. I do acknowledge this might very much be a personal preference, but I often find myself a bit disengaged by books that feel more like argumentative essays than stories, if that makes any sense. That said, I have encountered works with strong, clear themes that I've still thoroughly enjoyed. So I do appreciate, again, it's almost impossible to generalize here. I think many of you watching this might feel that I've overgeneralized some points or neglected to emphasize others, and that's a fair critique. It is so challenging to cover every angle of such a complicated topic. Believe me, if I had the capacity, I would make this video 4 hours long, but it is what it is. Now, the question is, should you trust BookTube and people like me? Well, check out this video to find the answer. Oh, you're still here and you want more? Well, the good news is that I have a Viking book club on my Patreon. If you join my Patreon, then you get access to an exclusive book club where every single month we read one book together and the book can be put forward by you. If you join tier 3 or 4, then you can put a book forward and then I randomly choose a book from the pot that we end up reading together, and throughout the month we discuss the book on the Patreon chats, and then we also have Zoom hangouts, which honestly are some of my favorite times of the month. This month we're reading this book and next month we're gonna be reading this book. Also, since I launched my Patreon, I basically spent my money back into the channel on video editing. I've had more than 40 videos professionally edited, so if you want to support what I do here and also help me upload more consistently, then I'll leave a link in the description down below.